Hello everyone. Welcome to LSE, London School of Economics and Political Science. So I'm Drukthar Gyal. And we have Carole McGrahanan is a Tibetan expert, and then we have Darig Thokmay. He's a Tibetan history, and his work is more about 18th, 19th, 20th century Tibet, China, Mongolia, and then we have Professor Martin Mill. He will join online. So I will introduce Professor Dibyesh Anand. Professor Dibyesh Anand is a professor of international relations at University of Westminster, and is the author of monograph Geopolitics Exotica, the Tibet in Western Imagination, Tibet, and a victim of geopolitics, Hindu nationalism in India, and the fear of politics. So Dibyesh worked so many things about Tibet, China, and he is one of the most important Tibetan experts in UK. So he will chair the today's panel.
Thank you so much, Drukthar. Now, the reason I'm chairing this panel is not because I'm one of the most important scholars. The reason is because we know each other, he could ask me very easily at the very last minute, which was yesterday. So that's there, and because all of us are equally experts. And one thing, of course, we have to clarify is, you're right, when we discuss anything, we don't discuss it on particular agendas. We discuss because these are important subjects. But we also bear in mind that these important subjects are more than scholarly. They're more than research. It is about lived experience. And this is why, for instance, many people might be very sensitive about, let's say, reincarnation. And all I would say is when I talk about reincarnation, it's not driven by what a particular person or particular reincarnation, but about the whole idea of reincarnation, how it's being used, misused, contested, etc. And as scholars, it is our duty to look at what has happened, what is happening, and what may happen. And in that sense, I can safely say all of us, we have no particular thing in terms of intervening in political debates about what should or should not happen. We have our own views, of course, but it is very much about understanding the history, and contested history of it, what is happening, what might happen. So that's a broader picture. And Drukthar gave us, did he give you the questions? The question, no, precisely. So remember he mentioned that I have got two questions. Why does reincarnation matter for China, Tibet in particular? Why are various states interested? But he has not sent us that question. Yeah. So just to clarity, which is perfectly fine, and this is what makes the session more interesting. Of course, and we want to thank you for doing it. You see the people around. I know most of you would have very particular views about what might be happening. You might be more of experts than us in some context, and we do encourage more discussion later. So we had Martin talking about persons, so reminding us of course, and what you said, we are the ones. So when the China's claim is, and take China's claim at face value, that they are sovereign over Tibet. So the Chinese claim, yes, they use history, they use culture, but essentially it's about claim of sovereignty, that Tibet belongs to China, according to that language. And part of belonging, of course, is connected to Chinese sovereignty over Tibet as territory and population. And as of part of a sovereign, they have the sovereign right to therefore decide how the institutions that might flourish. And we had Martin reminding us, of course, that goes very much against how that institution ought to be seen, which is in this case, seeing it as a person rather than the office. We had Darig talking about, again, that even the history, where we see it's an interpretation or misinterpretation of particular history. And we had Carole reminding us, of course, that when we are talking of Chinese sovereignty, we're not talking of sovereignty of equals. It is essentially a colonial form of sovereignty. A colonial form of sovereignty which is based on denial of sovereignty to Tibetans. That's how it is, right? So that's a common part. So I'll take this conversation forward, and of course there'll be a lot of synergies here. And I wanted to focus a lot similar things on geopolitics part of it. So in terms of contemporary geopolitics, and at the heart of it lies politics. We can say, let's not politicize. Who's politicizing? And you pointed out that it's adoption, let's say, of Western ideas. The world we live in is very much based on Western ideas in terms of both adoption, adaptation, and contestation. So all the states in the world, even very anti-Western states, are in that sense based on Western ideas of nationalism, of sovereignty, statehood, territory, population. This is where my country ends, and this is where your country stops and where your country starts. That kind of language. We have done that. So of course, China is in that sense very Western. In fact, more Western than most European countries now. So Chinese claim, of course, is based on Tibet has been historically part of the motherland, 5,000 years, right? So they were part of it, and therefore not everything bad in Tibet is not our responsibility, but everything taking place somehow our responsibility, and we have control over it. But as Darig reminded us that even the golden urn system, if you pay attention, it's very much about, it was not only to support the Tibetans, but it was very much to support Gelug sect in that cause. It was to bring order, it was to reduce corruption, it was to reduce a situation where there might be loss of faith. So it was actually to promote Tibetan Buddhism of some form and bolster the authority of the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lamas. So therefore it was driven by a desire not to assert dominance, but to support an institution that was seen as a patron-priest relation thing. A modern country in last 70 years, which order number 5 was 2007, but there was a country that sought to regulate reincarnation much before China. That's Bhutan. In 1960s, they were the first modern country that brought a law which said that if you are, and the context was that in 1960s, suddenly a lot of young boys were being found as reincarnation of Tibetan Lamas in Bhutan. And that, as you can imagine, is a source of power, wealth, along with, of course, piety. So the rule was essentially that if your son is discovered, and your son is if your son is discovered as the reincarnation of a Tibetan Lama, and if you send them out of the country, they lose citizenship. You can take them out, but they lose the citizenship of Bhutan. So it was very much about Bhutan citizenship. Now you can see why Bhutan would do it at that point in time, 1960s, a precarious small state. What was happening in Sikkim was everyone was seeing India is going to take over Sikkim. Tibet was already taken over by China. So in case of Bhutan wanting to be very neutral, very safe, okay, fine, reincarnation, we respect it, but we would like to some kind of control. So in this case, the measures were not to destroy the institution. It was not even to control the institution. It was just to balance between, in this case, modern Bhutanese national states' sovereignty and interest, and balancing that with respect for Buddhism. It was again based on respect. So what I'm highlighting is both for the Qings and Bhutanese government, it was based on respect. Now, what is India's approach? Because India is an important actor in this case. If you take example of how India has approached reincarnation questions which go on to the court, etc., like the Karmapa issue is a big one, generally the government's approach, in practice, they might be quite dodgy in how they interact, right, act. But in reality, they're agnostic. You decide what's there. So Indian government doesn't claim the sovereign authority to decide which one is the real Karmapa or not. It's an agnostic approach. You see the commonality, therefore, in all three cases. There are three states, Qing Empire, the modern Bhutanese state, and the modern Indian state. It is about partly interfering, but interfering not to dominate, not to erase, not to disrespect, but to either allow for respect or balance things or be agnostic. Now, when we take example of how China is doing now in last 20 years, since 2007 in particular, 1990s, but more recently, the desire is very clear. It's not to generate respect for Tibetan Buddhism. It is not to protect Tibetan Buddhism. It's very much to domesticate it and erase it if it's required. And erasure, I would say, is in terms of while there's a proliferation of Trulkus and reincarnate lamas, there's also growing disrespect for them, because the more there is marketization of it, and there's more misuse of it, more, in this case, Tibetans will start losing faith in the institution. And in one sense, that's not an innocent or accidental byproduct of Chinese policy. I would argue that that's very much part and parcel of the policy, where there's so much of confusion, where there's so much of disrespect. And so in that sense, when Chinese government interferes, it's not only to control the institution of the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, but also to generate disrespect for the very institution. That's there, right? Now, one thing to bear in mind, of course, is 2007, China, by most most countries in the world recognize Chinese sovereignty, right? We may not, but that's how they recognize. They will say, okay, Tibet is part of China, etc. That's how they do it. So by that angle, you could say that China has, therefore, the authority to govern its territory, in this case, and population Tibet. But their claim is that order number 7 is nothing odd, because all they do is, like any other government, like any other secular government, it does want to make sure that religion doesn't go out of control. So it's it's governance is the language they use. So the idea, of course, is 1982 Constitution of China, PRC, protects the right of freedom of religion for ordinary citizens, not for Communist Party members. That's fine. Except when you look at order number 7, it says that it's China Buddhist Association that will be responsible for licensing of reincarnate lamas, right? China Buddhist Association. if China Buddhist Association was independent, or at least semi-independent of the Communist Party, you could say at least fine. It's not ideal, but you have got a semi-independent Buddhist association that's looking after a Buddhist matter. The point is, China Buddhist Association is part of United Front Work Department. United Front Work Department, is part of Communist Party of China. So very clearly, while government doesn't state, it's not a state control, it's a Communist Party control. So absolutely, there's no autonomy there. So China Buddhist Association has no authority and no capacity to ever say that, to the Beijing, that, yes, this is what you want, but as Buddhist Association, this is what we will believe in, which is somehow different from Communist Party, because they are part of Communist Party. So we have a situation where, of course, therefore you have while the state officially allows for freedom of religion for ordinary citizens, the party doesn't allow anyone to be religious when they're members of the party, right? And that party is the one that controls the process. So you could see, therefore, that it's an atheist party controlling the process and claiming the final authority to decide on matters of not this world. That's how I'm putting it forward, right? Now, and again, I'll not repeat it, but I would talk of the colonial part. So it's very much part and parcel of Chinese colonialism. It's absolute control over each and everything. It's not enough to control the territory, not control to have flag, not enough to control population, not enough to have Xi Jinping and others pictures in altars, right, prayer altars. It's not enough to control economy, not enough to control institutions, every aspect of it. But they also want to control reincarnation. That's it. There's absolutely no aspect of Tibetan life that has to be left outside Communist Party control. And that is why reincarnation becomes important for them. It's not only so much in terms of they believe that I'd be surprised if any Communist Party leader seriously thinks that their choice of, let's say, in 50 years, 100 years, the next Dalai Lama would actually again have legitimacy amongst Tibetans. They can't. But that doesn't matter, as I said, because their whole purpose is to bring disrespect to the institution and bring more confusion and then use muscle power elsewhere, right? That's how they would function. Because that's very much part and parcel of what we can call colonial hubris, arrogance. And they do believe that they can manage to control, right? That's how it functions. Something else I wanted to highlight in this context, of course, is if you take the Dalai Lama, and I would want to link it to, it is about the Dalai Lama, but it's more than the Dalai Lama. It is about Tibetan self-determination. And that's one I want to argue that yes, as the Dalai Lama said, he will decide, right? So whole, of course, idea that it's him who comes back in some form. So if you take an individual person-based perspective, then you can imagine, if you take away my right to decide what happens to my body and what happens to, in my case, belief of where I come back, you're denying me my agency. Right? It's very much an attack on individual right. A person, my entire person is being taken in that sense, it's very much about enslavement. That's what enslavement was, taking away my complete agency. That's what is there. But I would say that actually it's not even about the Dalai Lama himself. It is about Tibetan self-determination. So the reason why Chinese government is so particular about these governance matters is more than about the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. It is about erasing the very identity of Tibetans in terms of history, that you had no independent history. Remember when with the middle way, the approach of the Dalai Lama and the negotiation, if you look at it, there's a lot of common. So Dalai Lama has given up on independence. He's given up a lot, right? So it's about being part of PRC with some dignity, etc. Where the sticking point in 2009 and 10, after 2008, was that Chinese government was not happy that Dalai Lama says, we are willing to be part of you and our future is with China. That he was willing to say. But he had to accept that Tibet was always part of China. So imagine a situation where it's not enough to say, look, actually, you control me now and I'm okay with it. But I have to say, I'm sorry I was wrong that I ever had an independent history. So you have to completely say that you were wrong about your history. So in this case, reincarnation, therefore, is very much about erasure of history, control over history, complete domestication. It is about control of the present, which they broadly control, but also control the present in every sense. But ultimately, it's control the future, where not only Tibetan institutions do not exist with any kind of autonomy, not only Tibet doesn't exist with any kind of autonomy or separateness, and as you pointed out, even the name is disappearing, and a lot of time even foreigners become complicit in it. But the idea ultimately is to erase the future of Tibet. So I would say that Chinese politics on reincarnation is any hope for Tibetan self-determination in the future. And therefore, as scholars, our job, of course, is to look at it, analyze it, etc., but also recognize that it is, it is more than about a particular institution. It is more about a particular practice that is very much and integrally connected to the whole idea of whether Tibet had its own identity or not. We know it had an identity. Whether it has identity or not, we know it's a colonized identity. But whether there's a possibility of it having ever an identity or not, and therefore push back against the Chinese state and a lot of others being complicit with it, Chinese state's desire to essentially crush and kill, and I'm using the word kill deliberately, any hope for Tibetan self-determination in the future. Thank you so much. And over back to you.